Welcome to another podcast from Team Performance Group. Today, we're going to talk about irrational markets and how to guide your clients through uncharted waters. Before we begin, of course, the lawyers always ask us to politely provide a disclaimer. So allow me to tell you, the information provided in this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered financial, investment, or legal advice. The hosts and guests are not financial advisors, and any opinions expressed are solely their own. Before making any financial decisions, please consult with a qualified professional. Investing involves risk, including the potential loss of principal. The podcast and its creators are not responsible for any financial decisions you make based on the content discussed. Matt Turnbull, a senior performance coach with Team Performance Group, and I'm happy to have my colleague Henry Sliker on today, where we're going to have a conversation surrounding what to do when we have irrational markets, when volatility is spiking and people start to question, what should I do? Thankfully, we've got a lot of experience in this area, and I am fortunate to have my colleague Henry Sliker join us today. Henry, the easiest question for me to ask to get us started is, what the heck's going on and what do we do about it?
Well, first of all, Matt, thanks for having me on today. I really appreciate it. There's an academic debate. Our market's irrational, our market's rational, and I don't think any financial advisor out there has any doubt that there are at least short-term periods of time where markets are highly irrational. And why is that? Markets aren't, they're not sentient. They are the sum total of the actions of the people who participate in the markets. If those people, do a lot of buying, markets are going to climb, and vice versa. So a question about, why are markets irrational is really a question about why are people irrational? And I think that the answer lies in our evolutionary biology. There's a couple of parts of the brain, and they didn't really, come into being at the same time. So the back of the brain's the limbic system. That's our lizard brain, it's associated with highly emotional memories, and it's the conduit for the bodily emotions to make it to the frontal cortex where we make decisions. And the frontal cortex is, of course, rationality, language, things like that. And it turns out they don't work very well together. And the way I like to describe that is it's hard to do higher math when you're running from a lion. It just, the limbic system's going to turn on. You need all the energy you got to run as fast as you can. You don't need to digest food. You don't need to think about things or remember your, locker combination from sixth grade. What you need to be doing is running as quickly as possible. And that helps us survive if we're being chased by lions.
So Henry, that's really that fight or flight mechanism that's I'll say hereditary. It's coded into our caveman brain, if you will.
It really is. And I would add fight, flight, or freeze, which you'll see some people do. That's actually an older evolutionary response.
So playing possum comes into play too.
You betcha. You betcha.
Okay.
And that's why you see, people are in real trouble and they're standing there and they really shouldn't be.
Well, you say that people can get in trouble, and you talked about it's really that fight, flight, or freeze mentality, which is our earliest brain or most developed brain. But how is it if we have this experience? How come people still do it? Why do we still freeze or make the wrong, start to panic when we should rationalize?
Well, we did evolve to run away from lions, but we did not evolve to trade stocks. And so we don't have a mechanism to recognize that emotional feedback. And our limbic system defaults and tells us that we must be in grave danger if we're feeling like this. We're getting a false signal from the nervous emotions in our bodies. And that's the root of the problem. And by the way, that's the root of all the anomalies that have been identified by the field that we call behavioral economics. People that do things irrationally, and there's a reason, and it leads to really bad outcomes.
Well, I suppose when you say, reaching bad outcomes, I know there was a survey done just about a week and a half ago in the middle of March that took investor sentiment, and over 58% of the respondents were bearish on the market right now. And there's another survey, which is the confidence board, came out and said that they had a reading of 92.9, which doesn't mean anything to any of us, with the exception to say it's the lowest number they've had in decades in terms of consumer confidence. So there's kind of a, you tell me, is there kind of a perfect storm of panic out there because people are bearish and confidence is low? And what should people be doing then?
Right. Well, one of the roles you have as a financial advisor is to sort of act as a confidant or a coach to the clients. Left to their own devices, folks sell low because they're scared and they buy high because they're excited. And, that's probably the exact wrong thing to be doing. And so what you want to do is you want to prep these folks. And the way you prep them is at the point at the point of sale or where the plan is implemented. You do not want to have your first conversation with a client about irrational markets and don't sell when things are down when the market's down 1,000 points that day. They're going to be very difficult to persuade if you haven't done the prep work. And what does the prep work look like? Well, if I know some great things about the market, and I do, for instance, in U.S. history, there have only been 3 rolling 10-year periods, and think how many rolling 10-year periods of U.S. history there are, where markets have been negative. Only 3. That's the good news. Here's the bad news. They're all recent and sequential. They started in 2000, 01, 02, that 12-year period was a disaster, the worst 12-year period in American history in terms of market returns. But there's a silver lining. What's the silver lining? The average stock, the median stock, the stock in the middle was up during that time. The only way that can happen is if you have a left tail to the distribution, meaning that there were a lot of bankruptcies and near bankruptcies. And if you had those companies, you were in real trouble. And if you didn't, you made money during this awful period. This is also the best way to back test a portfolio. If I did okay in the worst 12-year period ever, and I do okay in normal times, then it's probably a pretty good portfolio. And I can use that with a little coaching from my financial advisor to help me keep my confidence when things get tough. So one of the things I tell clients as they're starting to make that purchase, okay, we're going to buy this annuity, this mutual fund, a couple of stocks here and this, whatever it is, I say, the day will come when markets are irrationally negative and you're going to be tempted to sell. And here's why you don't. We go over them. This type of company always comes back if they have, great dividend policy, good balance sheet, cash on the balance sheet, you'll be fine. So when you call nervous to sell, mathematically and historically, the best thing you can do is buy what you're thinking about selling. Will you be able to do that, Mr. or Mrs. Client? And of course they say yes. And I say, no, you won't. You're going to be so scared. It's not going to happen, but I'm going to do you a favor. I'm going to write down what I suggested you purchase, how much of it, what time, what price. I'm going to add it to your file. And 6 months later, I'm going to give you a call and I'm going to tell you what your rate of return would have been. Now, I'm not rubbing it in. It's probably going to be up. It's probably going to be good. I'm not rubbing it in, but what I'm trying to do is set the table for the next time you're nervous, maybe a couple of years later. And maybe then you'll remember the episode and you can start to overcome, your limbic distress and bring the frontal cortex back in. You go to a hardware store and screws are on sale. You should buy, not sell screws, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay. Well, you're talking a little bit about, the irrational thinking. And I think someone once famously said there's irrational exuberance immediately prior to that 3-year period, 2001, 2002, 2003, to talk about people making mistakes as markets were plummeting. But do people make mistakes in the opposite direction too? Can there be irrationality, I guess, when we're at highs?
Absolutely. And that's a little harder to find an illustrative story for when you're prepping the clients. But yes, you absolutely should do that too. So I think we all remember, 99 and 2000 when, people would literally walk in my office and say, my Uber or my cab driver told me I need to buy this pets.com or something. And you look it up, it has no revenue, no earnings, no, nothing. And I would, and I got my story during that time. It's not a pretty one. I had 10 clients transfer out because I prevented them from going on margin to buy very risky stocks in late 1999. 10. That's a lot. And it didn't make me very happy at the time. And I thought, these people are still my friends. I still care what happens to them. I'm going to wait till I feel the market is bottomed. And I'm going to call these folks back and see if I can't win them back as clients. Sometime around October of 2002, the market bottomed. I felt like it had. I was right. It could have been wrong, but you get me wrong sometimes. So I called all 10, and I got exactly 0 clients back from the experience. One told me, a couple of months ago, I figured out you were right all along. I was too embarrassed to call you and eat crow. So I called somebody else and I transferred, and I wouldn't feel right moving the account twice. So I'm just going to keep it there. And I said, that sounds fine. I wish you nothing but the best. If you have a bad experience, give me a call right away. Otherwise, you won't hear from me. Good luck to you. The other 9 told me, I would come back to you, but I don't have any money. I was so heavily on margin that I lost everything. I had to write a check to close the account. So if I prep a client and I say, if the time comes where the markets are screaming and you got fear of missing out, right, which is also limbically derived, by the way, you have fear of missing out and you say, no, I got to buy this stock because blah, blah, blah. I'm going to remind you of this story and I'm going to ask you to think it over. So that's the way you prep for both directions.
Okay, so you can prep people for that, but are there times where emotions still get in the way and people say, I don't care, Henry, just do it?
Yes. Not only are there times, all of those times are those times. No one will ever see that decline and first think, didn't Henry prep me? They will first panic. The prep, what it does, it just reminds them that you've heard this story before. And what I'm trying to do at those times, either they're super excited on the buy side or super depressed on the downside. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to disengage the limbic system and I'm re-engaging the frontal cortex. And the way I do that, there are really 2 methods. One is I want to depersonalize the problem. So I say, you remember all those things we talked about when you first bought this, and I remind them of it. And I say, if a friend came to you and said, should I buy the stock that my Uber driver told me about? What advice would you give to your friend? It's not you anymore. And you don't need, you watch a horror movie, you're not hiding in the basement. you know, but it's not you.
That's
terrible.
Hard.
But if you were in the horror movie, right, in real life, you might darn well be hiding in the basement because you're not thinking clearly. And so what I'm trying to do is depersonalize the problem, bring them back in, let them think a little more clearly. That method works for most people. Now, if you've got really intelligent, geeky, nerdy clients, and I had a lot of biologists and all kind of engineers and all sorts of folks like that as clients. You can actually ask them to do complicated math, right? Hey, is 539 prime? Just can you think it through for a minute? And what that does is you can't do math when you're running for a lion. It's telling I'm not really being chased by a lion, right? It works for me, and it worked for many of my clients. It doesn't work for most people, but it's a technique out there. And then and you can use both if the client's right, but whichever thing or things you do there, the first thing you do is what I'm about to do. And that is, I'm going to slow the pace of the way I'm talking, and I'm going to calm you down. And the way I do that is to change my tone and my pace. And I first learned this in the U.S. Army. I heard my company commander call for a medevac one day, and it sounded like he was ordering a side of slaw with his barbecue. And the young man died, and I was devastated. I was close to the company commander, and I called him out. I went to see him, and I said, this is awful. It sounded like you didn't even care. And he looked at me and he said, Henry, he said, if I had panicked on that radio, everybody in the sound of my voice would have panicked. And so I was intentionally calm, even though I was boiling inside. And I realized this has more applications. So I added that to my bag of tricks.
Yeah. And that's a powerful example, Henry, and I'm sorry for that too. But one of the things that you highlighted or rang in my mind as you gave that story about pace and tone is really one of the elements of being empathetic towards others. It's, as we've talked, it's natural for people to become excited or irrational, as we've talked about that. But as you said, turning it down, slowing it down, getting the pace back. Is there harm in being empathetic to their feelings through this process?
No, that's what it's about. And, if a client doesn't understand that you care, then this is this isn't going to go well, right? They need to know that you're doing this out of abundance of care. And that brings up another really good point too, Matt, is at the tail end of that, when I've got you back, okay, all right, maybe we won't sell everything, right? Okay, Matt, before I push the sell button, is it okay if I remind you the reasons that we bought the portfolio that you bought? I'm going to give the signature story that I gave when you first did it, nice and calm, right? I'm going to ask you what advice you would give to a friend. We're going to do all of that, right? And then if I get you to say, can I get you to hang in there? And you say yes, I now shift gears and I want you to think of something else. So I will say, fantastic. Hey, how are your kids doing? Right? Or didn't you tell me your dog had been ill? How's, Fido, doing these days? I want you to feel, that connection that you felt when we were in the office, when we were having this conversation.
So really you're reconnecting from not just the limbic, the knee jerking, but back to that cortex where you're programming them back to thinking, right?
That's exactly what we're trying to do. We want to engage the ability to have a rational thought. A lot of folks think that you should make important decisions without emotion. That is not the case. You want to make them with the right amount of emotion. Too much emotion, we know what that looks like. We see it every day. But too little emotion is you don't know what's important anymore. If I said, hey, do me a favor, make sure you take that medicine so you don't die and clean your desk, and you can't remember, there's no emotional content, you might pick the wrong one. And that sounds goofy, like no one would do that. But there are lots of medical cases where there's a piece of the brain that makes that connection. It's called the anterior cingulate cortex. And if that part of the brain is damaged, those folks clean their desks and die. There's no emotional difference between the two. What we're trying to do is we're trying to bring the brain back into balance to get better outcomes. And
okay. So getting people back, that's a major part. And for those that are out listening today on the call too, it's to say what actions or what things can they do right out of the gates to either confront or to diffuse this if they're running into it.
Yeah, sure enough. And if you've done the prep work like we just talked about in the first part of the podcast, this is a lot easier, right? The best time to plant a tree is 25 years ago. The second best time is today. Let's say you just made an acquisition, you bought a book of business, and you haven't had a chance to have all the interaction you wanted to have with these clients. They don't have your signature story to fall back on, right? And so what I like to do there, we're gonna try to depersonalize like we talked, or have them do math. What advice would you give to a friend? And I'm going to go straight to the tone. And then the other thing I like to do is I like to quote the Dalbars. There's a number of Dalbar studies, but there's one in particular that I like to reference. And that is that Dalbar approached Charles Schwab and said, hey, how many of your mutual funds have been up 10 straight years with no down years? And 3, it turned out. And how many of your clients owned only some subset of those 3 funds the entire decade? right? Owned it at the first day and owned it on the last day, and owned nothing else. And turned out there were many. And then they said, may we have the anonymized data? They got it. And when they ran it, that portfolio, if you'd bought equal dollar weightings of those three funds, you were up double digits per year for that decade if you bought in the beginning and held to the end. But the average client who owned those funds was only up slightly over 2%. And many of them lost money because they sold low and bought high repeatedly. Some of them lost a lot. So these are smart people. They were able to comb through and figure out these funds are great investments. And they didn't go away from the fund because they had a bad experience. They stuck, but they gave in to irrational thought. They didn't have a coach, I would guess, or a good advisor, and they ended up losing money. So I tell that story if they haven't, already heard, or maybe in addition to the other prep story I talk about, right?
Sure. And I can understand that, because it's so often the expression I've used is time in the market versus time in the market, and making sure that it's being committed to what your investment decisions are or what your goals are, and the decisions made around them. But a few other notes that I recognize too when we speak about empathy, when we talk about dealing with the irrationality of people, we're talking about it more neurologically, I suppose, but there's been a lot of work around that too in the behavioral finance side of things. And we have, behavioral finance, for those listening, talks about the different types of biases that creep into our decision making, which hopefully we've explained out as to what causes those things. But there are certainly things, Henry, as you give the people chasing the best performers and making bad timing decisions, that there are a lot of biases, such as recency bias, or if there's a darling of the market, that could be media bias, because they're being highlighted often, and so people hear them more often and think that, oh my gosh, we have to get in. So there are different biases like that. Anchoring, if you had a great quarter and then there's some volatility and you start to get irrational, it could be because you anchored it to that end of the year statement that showed, wow, all-time highs, and then realized that the markets may be off, but in the greater scheme of things, if an account or a portfolio has been up 60 or 70% over the last 3 years, and it's down 5% or 10% right now, it's still up 60 or 65% over the last 3 years. So framing is another bias that can be out there. And to your point, Henry, you do a wonderful job explaining that when you first are introduced, developing relationships and opening up relationships, having the conversations there is really the best time to do that. But when it doesn't happen, empathizing that we understand that there's some reason to be nervous, but then establishing again your leadership as an advisor to let the clients know that it's not unnatural for them to feel that way. However, our experience shows that we should be doing the following instead. And you gave some great examples of that, but it also reestablishes, I'll say, the relationship to what a financial advisor ought to be. Financial advisors are the people that really save you from what's unseen, what's around the corner, and being able to prevent bad decisions to be made under times of stress, and recognize where it can be opportunistic to grow as well. So, Henry, is that a fair assessment or update to your topic here?
I'd say you pretty much nailed it. And maybe the only thing I would add is, I think a lot of advisors are familiar with behavioral finance now. I think probably 90% are. Go back and think about this two-brained model that we've laid out here today, and reread some of that stuff, and all of a sudden, you'll get the ahas.
Absolutely. So with that being said, Henry, I appreciate you taking the time to being on with us today. And again, for those that are listening, thank you for tuning in. To reach out to Henry or myself, you can contact us through our webpage at support@irrational.com. teamperformancegroup.com. Again, support at teamperformancegroup.com. So we appreciate you listening today, Henry. As always, it's a pleasure. I learn a lot every time that we talk, so I want to say thank you. And again, we look forward to working with everybody who's out there today. So give us a call. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Matt. This was great.
All right. Thank you, Henry. Bye-bye.